Hello, everybody. I am pleased to moderate this session. We have in this Black Sea Trust event, which is organized in collaboration with Eastern and Southeastern Europe FANEL network. We have as a special guest Antonia Colibășanu, author of the book Geopolitics and Geoeconomics in the New World 2.0. And we also, let me present you the other participants. So Alison Fedirca, who is Director of Analysis, Geopolitical Futures, who is a colleague of Antonia Colibășanu, who is also Chief Operating Officer, Geopolitical Futures, and Katarina Zakic, Research Fellow, Institute of International Politics and Economics, Center for Belt and Road Initiative. I also have to say that Antonia Colibășanu is also a senior lecturer at the National University for Political and Administrative Studies, and I'm very happy that we are colleagues. I'm also teaching, I'm a professor at this university and also a vice rector. And I'm very pleased, and I thank Black Sea Trust for inviting all of us. So this event, which is entitled Contemporary Geopolitics and Geoeconomics, a toolkit to understanding the world, is meant to discuss a few contemporary, very important trends on the basis of using geopolitical methods and geoeconomic methods or kits. I'm going to start because Antonia is the author of this book, which was launched in Romania last year, but now she's about to launch this brand new book in English, which has an extra chapter on the pandemics and the consequences of the pandemics at the world scale. So I'm going to address the first question to Antonia. Geopolitics is revered by many, but also contested by some people specialized in international relations. What is the relevance of geopolitics nowadays, Antonia?
Thank you very much, and thank you, Liliana, and thank you, Black Sea Trust, for inviting us all, after all, in discussing this matters. I am very much honored to be on the very same panel with two good friends, longtime friends, and with Katarina Zakic from Serbia, who will join me in being the economist on this panel. So two economists as well. And to answer your question, well, yes, because we lived in the post Cold War era when people were contesting geopolitics because we all thought that we are going to live in a globalized society where cultures, nation states will no longer or will matter in regards to being different individually for the cultural aspect, but not matter in international politics, which is wrong. And the fact that we hoped for peace does not mean that the nation state ceased to exist. In fact, national interest actually existed after the end of the Cold War, very much so, and it was in the process of building up the globalized world that we all hoped for, that we actually seeked national interests in putting together international organizations, for instance. Now, after some time, since the 90s, after an economic crisis that was pretty harsh, worldwide. We are at the point where I believe we are starting to see national interest in the very first, not necessarily on the very same page and on the very front page of international relations. So international got back to states. It's no longer the idea of diversity and unity worldwide. Now, obviously, that's only natural for me to say because all I've been doing was geopolitics and studied how the terrain actually shapes the human being and the societies that human beings form. So I would say for those that do not really believe that geopolitics are still actual, an actual method to see the world, I would suggest that only when we will no longer have borders, we will have a world with no geopolitics. Until then, we need to take and to understand the world, considering geography and the other elements of geography, including politics and economics together. So that's the essence today.
In your book, you are, as you said, you are discussing globalization, and you kind of look at globalization and as an antithetical, as opposed sort of contrasting it to geopolitics, to the assertiveness or new assertiveness of national interest. My question, just to introduce more the listeners and our viewers to your book, would be in this tension between states and globalization, what are the trends that you identify in your book? Because geopolitics is meant to identify future trends, global trends. So what global trends do you identify in your book, Antonia?
Mm-hmm. So yes, to start with, there is not really an antithesis. It is an opposing tension between globalization and geopolitics in the sense of policies. So we believe that being interconnected, we are also more similar, which I very much plead for being incorrect in the book. So in this sense, you're correct. However, interconnection shapes the global trends geopolitically. So what I mean by that is that considering that we are closer to each other, like right now we are using technology, for instance, to be on the same panel while Katarina is in Serbia and we are, I'm in Bucharest, you are in Bucharest, and Allison is in Washington, D.C. We are also similar in our profession, but our nation states have different situation right now from political and economic standpoint, have different power, have different ways of influencing for supporting their interest. Now, in this sense, after the crisis of 2008 and after the beginning of the pandemic, because I would very much like to say after the pandemic, but we are not yet there. I do believe that the most important global trend is referring to the society being in a time of tensions because of the differences between the urban and the rural, between the classes, and between the peoples that live within their communities, that are very much attached to their communities inside the nation states, and that are building on the power of the nation states in the same time. What do I mean by that? I suggest, and this is also in the book, I suggest that the nation state will have to focus more internally, and the politics will have to focus more internally to make sure that the society remains stable, particularly because of these differences between classes and between the urban and the rural world. And in the same time, geoeconomics puts us together and puts us into the so-called technological progress, on the so-called technological progress train, which basically means that companies, our economic activity, will focus more and more on interconnectedness, and supply chains will be very much related to this new infrastructure that we are using now, while the nation state and the politics behind the economics, so the political economy, will have to take into account whatever happens within the society. And this is probably the major issue that is going to shape our world, at least in the coming years. Now, if I were to comment on the very particular geopolitical trends, I do see our region, which is the Southeastern Europe, and I include in that the Black Sea region and the Eastern Mediterranean regions as being key focal points for the world to come. Because if we've seen rising powers, rising regional powers, like Russia, like Turkey, like Iran, up to now and growing, we now see a focus of the major global powers within the region. And I'm talking about the US and China both. The US was present in the region. China was signaling that it wants to be present. And it is the outcome of the pandemic that will really tell us how China will become more involved in this region or less involved. So because of all this, and also because those tensions that I was talking about are very much particular to our region. And we've been there so many times before in what we call transition processes. We are very much into the new world already. In this sense, we have the opportunity to know what's coming. We know that a lot of tension produces also the opportunity to innovate politically and economically, but in the same time, being the center of the geopolitical tension is not an easy role to play. So that's the second, and the one that will very much shape our day-to-day role in Romania, Serbia, and Eastern Europe in general. And with that, I will stop here because I'm pretty sure that I'll have to raise my hand on the secondaries for these two major global trends.
You know, if we are to combine what you say about the fact that states have to focus internally to sort out the tensions, the rural, urban, and classes differences, and if we look at the Russia, Iran, and Turkey, the innovation inside these states politically don't look very, very good to me, at least. And I'm sure that to many people who are democratically minded and liberally minded. And because you mentioned our region, I would like to focus now more on our region and also open the discussion to our colleagues, to Alison and Katarina. So in your book, Antonia, you say that basically 2008, and you even mentioned a bit earlier, this year, 2008, many things happened, the beginning of the crisis, but also the recognition of Kosovo and coincidentally or not, you are saying it's not coincidentally, the war between Russia and Georgia and the consequences, which we are not going to discuss. So my question to all of you would be, what are the major tensions in our region? If we look at it with a geopolitical and geoeconomical perspective. So when I'm thinking of our region, let me be more direct and say that I see that Romania is kind of at the intersection of several regions, Eastern Europe, or the post-Soviet space, maybe it's a better description, Western Balkans, Central Europe, and Black Sea. So what do you foresee in terms of disruptions in our part of the world?
I guess I should start, but I'm going to warn you that I'm going to let Katerina focus more on the economics of this this matter. So what I see to be, let's say, the three tensions, the three major tensions that we are having now, besides solving the pandemic problems, which is an ongoing effort and is something that we should treat carefully, and that intersects actually with the power play. One refers to Turkey and to the Turkish poster in the Black Sea and in the Caucasus, and the relationship between Turkey and the US, and that between Turkey and Russia in particular, when it comes to the Black Sea. The fact that Turkey has indeed built up politically for a stable network so that it can project power, and the goal, the very much public goal of Turkey today is that of neo-Ottomanism, which means influencing through the region, through the Balkans and through the Caucasus, forging alliances that also have economic, but not only economic aspects. So that is one key mark that refers to the potential tensions, because whatever Turkey does in the Black Sea will refer to the Caucasus, where it's all about tensions and influences between the states and between Russia and Turkey and the West. And whatever Turkey projects into influencing in the Balkans refers to the tension between the EU and Europe altogether, and us ultimately on the borderline, and Turkey. And here it's a broad array of issues, from, if you want, the refugee crisis to economic patterns that refer to trade, and how we allow or how we open up to other states that are not EU members, like Turkey. Then another key element, since I'm talking about the EU, refers to the EU, to the European Union potential. We know that the new EU Commission, for instance, has said that it wants a geopolitical EU. So in this sense, I'm quite happy, because you know, geopolitics turned back in fashion if the Commission talks about geopolitics, right? But leaving that aside, it's trendy. But leaving that aside, we have to see whether the EU can really have a core, can really have a common voice when it comes to political alignment. With Brexit, we clearly made some room into having the EU coming together and potentially being able to get on the same page with political aspects. However, the economic crisis has shown us that we live in a European Union that has multiple regions. We also know that our strategic security interests in the East, countries that have recently joined the EU, even if it's not so recently anymore. There have been some years passing by since. But our strategically and security interests are not necessarily the very same with the Western Europeans. So this tension needs to be solved in order to really have a geopolitical actor. Basically from this tension arises another one that refers to the way that the EU is dealing with its neighbors. Its neighbors in the Western Balkans that want to join the EU, but are also very much realistic about what the EU means. But also neighbors outside the European peninsula, like China, or even more so like Iran, where there are multiple interests at play, and it's a global power gamble in a sense. And obviously the relationship with Russia, because that is at the very core of the tension inside the EU, between the East and the West, let's not forget. So those are the EU and Turkey, together with their relationship with states like Russia, the US, and China, is what I see to dominate the area, the geopolitical area of tensions around here.
May I invite Katarina or Alison? Would you like Katarina first, and then I will invite Alison?
Well, first of all, thank you, Liliana, and thank you, Antonia, for inviting me to be here today. And I also want to use this opportunity to congratulate Antonia on publishing her book in English language. And I would like highly to recommend to all today's attendees this book, because I was so privileged to have the opportunity to read this book. And as Antonia said, it's not just an ordinary, boring geopolitical book. I even mentioned to Antonia that I think one day she would be a great novelist. So I think that is a good recommendation for those of you who would like to learn something about geopolitics, but you don't know enough, or you are well established in this field, but you want to know more, because Antonia's knowledge about so many regions, about so many things is really impressive. And I think that with this book, she will reach a big success. And I think that even for your students, I think the book is, of course, part of their, their studies. I think that they will learn a lot. As Antonia said, there are several things within my region, and that is Western Balkan region, although I need to stress out that I don't like that word, Western Balkan, because we do not have North Balkan or South Balkan, but we only have Western Balkan. And even if you mention to some of the countries that are actually part of the Western Balkan, that they are Western Balkan countries, they usually say, oh, I'm not quite sure about that. So it means that we are gathering the group of countries that is not so wanted anywhere, even in the EU. And judging by the events that we had in 2019 regarding North Macedonia and Albania, I think that we can see from that just one event what is the current state of the politics within the EU and the new countries that want to join the EU. I do completely agree with Antonia about the major powers that do play a major role in the Western Balkan region. So I would, in a way, say that there are three main forces within Western Balkans. So the EU is, of course, the number one. if you look from the economic point of view, most of the Western Balkan countries do cooperate with the European Union, and most of the investments and trade do go to the EU and with the EU. So for example, if you look upon the trade within the Western Balkan countries, you will see that the trade volume is actually decreasing. So it means that actually we are working more and trading more with the EU, not with our neighbors. And the same thing goes from the point of view of investments. 70% investments in the Western Balkan do comes from the EU. So that is the major geoeconomic player. But there are some other players, as Antonia said, like Russia and China most recently, that are actually, how to say, major forces in this region, Turkey as well. But I think that China, with these investments and two major international projects, such as initiatives Belt and Road, and such as, especially in this region, 17+1, are the forces that are actually initiating major changes in geoeconomic field. So I think while in this region, the EU is, of course, the #1, it would be very interesting to see, and we will speak a little bit later about that after the pandemic, what will happen, and if we will see the major shift in this region with the geoeconomic powers. So I will leave the floor to Alison to add things as she wants.
Yeah, so just a couple of things to pull it out of someone not in the region, if you will. I do agree that, you know, looking at the US, Turkey, Russia, China are all the major powers from the outside that we're going to be interested in. And that's not just because you know, we don't have necessarily a group think here. If you look at a map, you can see who are the big power players, and that's why you're going to have some of a consensus on Turkey and Russia in this area. And then you also can look at size. If you look at the US size, you look at China's size, it's undoubtable that they have a large reach and a large amount of influence that they can project in different places. The only thing I would add is to keep in mind that when we talk about people pursuing their national interests in this region, we're talking about global players exerting influence in an area where a lot of the countries can't stand toe-to-toe with them, meaning you're going to have smaller countries with less power being brought into this interplay between these broader powers, and that we're not going to see necessarily a one-to-one response. Powers will play to their strengths and the tools that they have. And so the way China pursues better relations in Eastern Europe is going to be very different than how the US would pursue them. China will throw money at Eastern Europe. Russia can't really pursue good ties with Eastern Europe, but they can go after Germany or different countries like that to put pressure in other areas. So when we do look at how does this all start to play out and flesh out in the future, keeping in mind that it's not going to be, oh, you know, I give $10 million to Bulgaria, they're going to give $10 million to Bulgaria. It's going to be a very different type of game where each country is going to play to their strengths to get what they need and get what they want. And so looking at what happens in Azerbaijan, looking at what happens in Serbia and Romania is all going to be important, because the responses in one area may actually occur in a different country to help counterbalance the different powers that are trying to gain influence.
Thank you for both answers. And when I listened to Katarina, I remembered when she was saying, you know, she does not agree with this term Western Balkans. I remember 20 years ago, our foreign minister, Andrei Pleșu, was talking about Romania as being Northern Balkans. So there you are. We are the Northern Balkans. I don't know which is the South, but yeah, it remains to be determined if we agree with that. Just a quick reaction to what Alison was saying. Well, Russia seems to be fairly well in very good terms with the government of Serbia. And the economic interests of Russia are fairly well represented there. So Yeah, even though, and this is an issue that we are going to approach a little bit later, even though Russia in economic terms is in a kind of downturn, somehow its imperial experience shows in terms of doing many things with less resources, at least when it comes to our region. And because we started to talk about economics, and I would like to thank Katarina for emphasizing this aspect that EU invests a lot in the Western Balkans, and this is very little known by the population. But because we started, to talk about economics, so I would like to quote from the presentation of the event by Alina Inaech, who unfortunately couldn't join us today. She was saying, the economic component of the nation states has grown in importance when it comes to establishing political power, and therefore geoeconomics comes to shape and update our analytical toolkit. What are the main geoeconomic trends in your views? Regionally and worldwide? Of course, the answers are going to be very different when it comes to these two benchmarks, but it's a kind of an open question just to introduce in the discussion more this geoeconomics as a toolkit of looking at the trends. I don't know, Alison, would you like to step in first?
So I'll go more with the global view. A few things. So when we talk about geopolitics, there's three main pillars: politics, security, military, if you will, and economics. So I would argue that economics has always been important, but we're living in an era now where it's much more prominent. A lot of the geoeconomic trends that we saw before COVID are still going on right now. So we talked about this idea of interconnections between different countries with either supply chains and relationships and companies. And we were seeing this redefinition taking place before COVID with renegotiations on free trade deals, the UK renegotiating all of its international trade agreements because it was leaving the UK, sanctions on different countries that were put in place in Iran and Russia. So the idea of economics being a geopolitical tool predates COVID, which I think is highlighted in the book prior to the COVID special chapter. And the way I would look at the trends now is that COVID marks an inflection point for these trends that we've already been observing. And it really intensifies and brings to the fore all of the tensions that are there, because when the economy is going well or it's good enough, no one worries. You never hear people say like, oh, well, I'm making above average wages, I'm pretty happy. Like, that doesn't make headlines. That's not what politicians are going to concern themselves with. But now we are at a point where every country in some way, shape, or form has suffered some type of negative economic impact. The degree varies by the different countries. The damage that's been done is uncertain, and the recovery is the main focus globally. And so when I hear, it's important now, I think of it as we are in a point in time where, for the first time in several decades, the global center of gravity, the global driver, is an economic force. We have not seen a global recession like this in a very long time. And so it is more important now because it is the center focal point, the whole globe, all of your politics, all of your social tensions over who has a job, who doesn't have a job, who can pay for their food, how expensive is food, all of these things go back to the economy. And so I would view this as a very intense inflection point of geoeconomic trends that we were seeing up to this, but it's really much more intense now than we've ever seen before. And so it's a totally different landscape in terms of how we think about the global economy.
Thank you, Alison. Katarina, would you like, because you're the economist, apart from Antonia, in our discussion?
Well, as I listened to Alison, I thought maybe she's also an economist because she has a great understanding of actually what is going on in the economy. So I do completely agree with Alison, because, you know, I'm living in Serbia, that was part of former Yugoslavia. And it was exactly like Alison said, while the economy was functioning in a good way, and we call those years in Serbia, sorry, in, you see, former Yugoslavia, the golden 80s, you know, everything was functioning very well. We were so happy, you know, people from all over the world were coming to Serbia, to Yugoslavia, to learn about self-management, to learn about how we are conducting our economy, our achievements, and so on. But actually, when the economy is starting to collapse, all the changes within politics started to change. And then you have the rise of nationalism, then you have the republics that do want to go separately, etc., etc. So regarding, like you said, global geoeconomic trends, of course, as Alison pointed out, everything changed because of the pandemics. And although we have some things that are still ongoing, even the things that were happening before the pandemic changed everything, you know. And as Alison said, it's a catastrophe like once per 100 years. So it's very difficult to stress out all the things that are happening at the moment. So we haven't had this kind of serious situation even in the 1930s. You know, because not all economies were hit by the crisis in 1930s as the same way as we have nowadays. So the forecasts that we have from international organizations such as IMF, such as the World Trade Organization are actually horrible, you know, and when you look up at the results for 2020, they're also horrible. For example, when you look at the global growth level, the IMF stated that in 2020, we will have minus 4.4%. of GDP. The OECD predicted minus 4.5. When you look at the trade level, you will see that in 2020, the decrease of global trade was 9.2%. When you look at the foreign direct investments, just in the first 6 months, they fell down by 49%, 49% down. For global economy, so if you look upon the global economy, it's awful. When you look at the national level, it's even more awful, because not all economies can survive this kind of hit. You know, it's not the same for the US or the EU. It's terrible for them, but it's not terrible like the countries in Africa or in Latin America. That's the completely different thing. So even those countries that survived this kind of hit and did introduce different health measures, because health measures, if they were conducted in a good way, then they influenced the good economic recovery. So those countries that handled crisis in a good way, such as the countries in the East Asia, such as China, Vietnam, South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, they achieved very good results. So I do hope that we will handle this crisis in a better way that we handled it so far. And if we do not handle it in a better way, I doubt that the economic results will be better.
Thank you, Katarina. The question that comes to my mind listening to you, how the solutions or who is supposed to answer most appropriately to this situation? Nation states or a form of governance, developing governance at the world level or at regional levels and so on and so forth. But I'm just throwing this idea here because I also wanted to invite Antonia. Maybe she would like to intervene in terms of the geoeconomic tool in her book and the trends.
Right. So I will add very little to what was said, and will refer a bit to why geoeconomics and why it is so urgent today than it used to be, as both Alison and Katarina pointed out. Today it refers to demographics. So, and it is urgently referring to demographics. we usually looked at demographics in terms of what kind of a socioeconomic model a country has, a nation state has. That was the framework, and that's also the model that I'm presenting in the book. And obviously, if you have an aging population, that means that you're probably going to get a lot more people to retire in the coming years. So that is an either investment-based economy or a trade-based economy, like Germany, for instance. If you have a young population, then you have a consuming economy. So obviously, the growth is going to be focused, the economic growth is going to be focused on consuming, on people consuming goods, sorry. But now we do not know exactly. So prior to the pandemic, we were in a situation where countries like Germany, countries like China, so the ones that were trade focused, the ones that were investment driven economies, were basically in a transition mode. They were looking for something else. They were looking to reform their model because they wanted to focus on a better model, right? To develop their economies differently, not necessarily because they urgently needed to do that, as there were still consuming economies around the world, like the US, Brazil was coming up, India was coming up. So obviously there was not an urgent need. But with the pandemic coming in, that is not necessarily an urgency to reform to something, but a reset. And a reset into the unknown, because we do not know what comes next, how exactly the demographics are going to change for all countries in the world. Considering the measures put in place, considering the types of viruses, like during the last year or so, we've become very much specialists in what the virus can and cannot do, and what kind of new viruses is coming up where, and so on. Which is, I mean, it's interesting. At least we are living interesting times, but what we do not know is exactly how the workforce is going to be affected. And not necessarily because we are going to have bankruptcies, but because we are also going to see, due to the supply chain problems in the beginning of the pandemic, we are starting to see a focus on national production, which is a type of protectionism that we have not seen before. I mean, we kind of, we've seen the trade protectionism at work, but we are back in the very, we need to produce at home. All that while we do not know what our social base will look like after the pandemic is over. So this is, again, to say that this is why geoeconomics is now very much important, because it's also a time when itself, the economy itself, is remodeling. So geoeconomics is remodeling, considering the new forces that are remodeling the economy, the political economy, if you like, through the decisions that political leaders are taking. What I love about geoeconomics and geopolitics in general is that it forces you to see the links. It forces you to go beyond one discipline of research. And if I were to say what's the global trend in education, for instance, well, knowing or finding ways to see the links, to see what exactly is dependent on what and what is important, which is pretty much what we are doing when we are doing geopolitical and geoeconomic analysis. And with that was supposed to be a very short answer. I'm sure it was not. So I'll shut up.
Thank you, Antonia. I think you emphasized a number of very interesting trends. I mean, I have to say, I didn't think of this fact that governments are actually, and states are focusing on producing at home. which yeah, it's interesting. So my next question is: are we stepping into a new world? And in this new world, what is the role of the United States, which state that kind of defined to a large extent what happened in the world in the last 3 decades? I don't know.
Allison, do you want to start? Since you are there.
Sure.
Yes.
So, yes, I mean, obviously we are transitioning into a new world, and I think we've already touched on a few of the different themes that kind of explain why, in terms of a transition out of the Cold War model, in terms of what Antonia just mentioned with an economic redefinition going on across the globe, to what Katerina said, is we haven't seen an event like this. It's a once in a century type event. So all of those things are going to usher in a new era. We are going to be seeing these demographic changes that Antonia was talking about. Supply chains, what's broken in the different economies. We still don't know what's broken in all of these national economies and where their deficits are going to be in terms of production or needs, what sectors can bounce back, what are gone forever, in thinking about it in that term. As for the US, this goes back to what Antonia was saying at the beginning of the call, where this concept of internal tensions within a country is going to be extremely important in the United States in the coming years. It's not a permanent feature in the United States insofar as, I'm going to come back to that, because otherwise without context it sounds really bad. But right now, what you can see easily in the United States is two deep divisions, and these divisions represent almost equal halves of the country in terms of what direction they want to take, what economic needs they have, and even to an extent, cultural and social beliefs of what they want to see in a future for their country. And also, because it is equally divided between one group and a second group, you have very little room to maneuver. You have very little political room to maneuver, because you are always going to have at least 50% of your country upset with what you do. So that's going to confine what the US can do. And then, of course, the economic impact of COVID is going to restrict what the US can do to some degree, because it needs to recover its economy just like everyone else. And as you mentioned, Liliana, it's not as badly hit as other countries, but because of the political pressures, it still needs to take economic action. So when I think of how we're going to see the US in the future, that's the first thing you take into mind, is that the US is going to need to be more calculating and more strategic with how it moves, because its bandwidth at home is much smaller. And so it can't just go around and have some type of folly overseas and say, oh, it's okay, because there could be domestic backlash, there could be economic backlash. And that room to maneuver is constrained now, that we have not seen in the past 20 years or so. And then the other thing is to keep in mind that the US role is about US power, right? It all comes down to power, and power is relative. So you have to see what other countries are potentially ascending and what other countries are potentially descending. Because even if the US has problems, if all of the other countries are falling apart, it can still look like it's, if you're 2 meters tall and you're standing next to somebody who's 1 meter, you're going to look like a giant. If you're 2 meters tall and you're standing next to somebody who's 2 meters and 10 centimeters, they don't look so tall anymore. So it's all relative, right? And that's important to keep in mind moving forward, because we've mentioned China in some of these things. And so the US interest right now is really pivoting towards China, because it's not a one-to-one contender at this point, but it is one of the strongest contenders in terms of global influence, in terms of global power. And so we are seeing a continuity in that sense with the US over the past 4 years to now, and moving forward, of having a antagonistic view towards China and wanting to keep China's rise to power in check. So in that sense, we will see some continuity, but it's the behavior, the approach and the strategies that the US takes is going to have to be much more calculating, because there is less room to maneuver. And there will be more countries like China, where 20 years ago, China wasn't a contender to the US. The Soviet Union had fallen. there wasn't a really big worry for the US to look out and say, okay, who else could challenge my interests somewhere else? And now we're entering a world where there are other players that are more formidable in terms of how they can contest the US.
You're unmuted. Okay.
I tried, I unmuted me. So somehow what you say just makes me think of, because we are emphasizing a lot, you are emphasizing a lot the economical side, but very little talk about military. And I think when it comes to military, the things are a bit different. But yeah.
Well, and that's
I wonder what are you saying about that?
Yeah. So in terms of, and that's what I mean more with when I talk about the U.S. being more constrained, that in my head, and I did not articulate it outwardly, is you're going to see a change in some military behavior, right? So we've already seen a push to draw down military presence of the U.S. overseas. That's going to continue. Now, to the extent that that's going to be successful is going to depend a little bit on the security situations in individual locations. The U.S. isn't going to abandon completely all of its military maneuvers overseas, but be more focused on where are their actual threats, where are their interests, and then reduce their presence where they can. And this is a reflection in part also to the growing trend of economics being very powerful in the world, and also the idea of the constraints, right? The US having less room to maneuver. So keeping your military overseas, which they've done for the past 20 years, is extremely costly. There's political prices to pay for that at home. There's financial prices to pay for that. And so all of these elements of what can they get away with politically? How much money do they have to do these things? Where should this money be going? You will see to some degree that impacting the military presence as well, because you know, if you can put sanctions on a country and reduce their capability to act against you, you don't want to spend billions of dollars stationing troops next door if it's not necessary.
Thank you. So, Katarina, would you like to react to this the main question about the entering a new world and the role of the US?
I just wanted to emphasize a couple of things that Alison mentioned, and I think that in the next couple of years, one of the main things within the US that will, in a way, show what will the new president do is the USA and China relations. And it is just my personal opinion that the previous Trump administration didn't do a good job to itself and regarding its economy in regards to USA-China trade war. You know, if you look up on the economic data, you will see that both countries were hit very hard during this trade war. And you will also see that the third countries benefited from this. Argentina, Vietnam, countries in the East Asia who were using part of this trade war to, of course, change the value chains and production chains, you know, and they, of course, benefited from this. Neither did China, neither did the USA. And I think that Alison living in the USA can testify what was the main hit in the USA. It was in the agricultural sector. The farmers lost their money. President Trump didn't lose his money, but his citizens lost the money. So I do hope that this situation will change during President Biden, but, big but. In his first couple of speeches, I didn't saw his intention to, in a way, easy negotiation process with China. His tone, even though is slightly moderate, he does state that China is the USA biggest rival, economic rival. So, but also, Mr. Biden is a well-established diplomat who has been in politics for many decades, and I think that he is a very smart man. So I think that his negotiation tactics and strategies will be different than those one that we had during the Trump administration. And I sincerely hope from the economic point of view that those trade relations and economic relations will be better. Why? because in economy, when you have monopoly, that is the worst situation that you can have. If you have oligopoly, or you have a high level of competition within the companies, it's much better solution for everyone. So I think even in economic sense, when you have just one big economic power, that's another good thing for other countries in the world. So if China and the EU and the USA in a way ease their relations and find adequate solution, everyone will benefit from that.
Interesting and optimistic, even though, I mean, optimistic in ideal terms. So we have to see how they are going to act, politicians, and in this sense. Now, there is not too much left of our session. However, there are two main questions which I cannot avoid, and we need to talk about them, I think. So I'm quoting now from Antonia's book. She says like that: Russia is far from weak, but its power has been undercut by economic problems. So my question to you is, what is your view on Russia in this respect? Whoever would like to answer, maybe, I know Antonia maybe first, or because that was her quotation.
Yeah, I'll start. I'll start to defend what I said. Russia is far from weak because it can project power, and it as Alison put it earlier, in geopolitics we have three dimensions that we need to look at: politics, military, and economics. Whenever Russia was weakened economically, we had the two other dimensions, politics and military, that acted on influencing what was going on and basically conserving Russia's power. We should also not forget that historically, projecting power for Russia has been basically using resources to the very limited costs of their use in order to sustain security and in order to defend the borders. From Russian perspective, they do not attack, but they defend themselves from others. And this is obviously coming from geography. It is also coming from historical tradition, so to say. However, we are now having a very interesting time for Russia, one that points to a weakening of the Russian economy, while it also points to a period where Russia tries to reinvent itself. So a transition period from a very resource-based economy towards a developing economy that tries to adapt and innovate so that it gets more out there in services and IT sector, for instance. So in the softer parts. However, Russia is not yet there. So the GDP of Russia points to the fact that the energy sector is still very much important, and therefore the oil price is still very much important for the Russian economic stability. That said, not only because of the pandemic, but also because of the, let's say, normal evolution in the energy sector, with the US coming to be a player in the energy sector as well, and with European Union and European states trying to have alternative routes to imported energy from Russia in particular, we basically have a case of Russia having social problems, socioeconomic problems, due to the fact that it cannot sustain, considering the budget is linked with the oil price and with the energy production. That is to come to a point in time when we have a very strong political Russia, in a sense. And that is also based on several diplomatic strategies that Russia put to play on influencing its own people of its power inside. So it's aggressivity, if you will, it's aggressive manners in the neighborhood that are meant to defend Russia are pretty much ways to ensure the population that Russia is strong and it is not weak and has the power to act, has the power to defend its own population. However, the economic problems of the populations in the Far East, for instance, or in towns where you basically have one industry that is no longer working very much, are putting to question the stability of the regime. So we are going to see protests. We are going to probably see socioeconomic distress. And it is up to the political power to come to play with solutions. And among those solutions is whether they have a way to fix the economy, or if not, then how and what kind of options do they have in the political and the military realm to assure the population that Russia is powerful. So that's what I meant, but by saying that Russia is far from weak, because we have a politically and military strong Russia. But its economy is kind of testing that.
So as geopolitics is rooted in the realist viewpoint, the realist perspective in international relations, it pays less attention to the economics. And actually there is one very important element which we didn't actually approach in our discussion, but that would have been much too much, is the technological aspect, and which is linked to the development. But that's for sure we are not going to approach now. But I would like to ask, maybe Katarina would like to react to this question about Russia's power coming from Serbia.
Yeah, that's a good point of view coming from Serbia. Well, I can just only agree with Antonia, and I don't have much to add, because that's completely what the reality of Serbian and Russian relations are. So actually the economic presence of Russia in Serbia, it's not so quite strong. Some people maybe don't know that. So Russia is the owner of our largest oil company, and there are several other smaller companies, but nothing else. So it means that the economic presence is downsized due to all the political problems that Russia has at this moment. So I think, as Antonia mentioned, the political willingness to change the economic situation in Russia would be the most important. The only thing that is worrying for Russia is its dependency on the oil and the oil prices. So when you have a country, and Antonia mentioned this a couple of times in her book, please buy her book and read her book. So it is important where your country is located. What kind of resources do you have? And when you have Russia, that is such a big country, you know, but the half of the country cannot produce crops, you know, and it's very cold, and you cannot even manage everyday life, let alone organize some kind of industry. And when your country is depending on oil, and you have the same situation with the Middle Eastern countries, the same thing. They are trying to diversify their economies. but it's going very, very slowly because it takes a lot of time to change your economy. And I see Russia as a pretty traditional country, you know, in a way that they organize their economic development. So it would be interesting to see if this pandemic will change their way of thinking. How do they approach all these terrible things that happen to all of us, and especially to Russia, and how they will handle the crisis regarding the oil?
What you're saying, Katarina, makes me think that probably Russia is present in Serbia more politically, informationally, ideologically, to compensate. Okay, yeah, it's very interesting what you just said. So can I just dare to ask you maybe very short answers? Who are the winners and the losers? Because when I'm saying winners and losers, I'm talking about the trends as a result of this pandemic, because Antonia approaches in her book, she has a chapter at the end discussing at length the physiology, anatomy of the pandemics at world level, at European level, at regional level. So who do you think there are the winners and the losers of this pandemic and crisis going
on? For whom is this the question? For Antonia?
If you just started to talk. And for our colleagues, Alison and Antonia, of course.
No, let Antonia speak first of all, because she has a full chapter on this topic in her book.
Antonia, please.
Yeah, I actually, the chapter is not only about how the world looks like, but what kind of questions we need to answer to analyze the world during a pandemic or a similar event. So to me, because this book is also about method, to me, the first question was, how should I approach this? And in theory, in a sense. And the chapter itself is very much different from the others, in the sense that the pandemic is a very different event than the others. So the way that I've approached it is very much different. However, I would say that there is no winner and there is no loser. I think that we are pretty much on the very same page with losing from the pandemic so far. I believe that it's not in our true manners, in our common behavior to deal with such an event. And therefore, we as societies, we as nation states, and therefore we are trying to be creative and trying to fix what can be fixed, actually. So considering the many unknowns on how we'll be after this, I believe that those countries that are going to be better off are those that are having access, obviously, to technology and science. And because of this, there will be the usual difference between North and South, for instance. Maybe less between East and West, but there will be some between East and West as well, which will add to all other problems that we've talked about at length, which refers to the tensions in the society. So it is to see. I don't see a particular country winning from this. And if economically the US is seeming to hold on, it is yet to be seen what exactly, as Alison pointed out, what exactly the pandemic does to the American society, to the US society. And what does it mean that the US will not be the only global power, because I doubt that there will not be the only global, the main global power, even if we have China as a global player, for instance. Considering the military capabilities of the US and considering that it does secure the oceans because it has to secure the oceans, their borders. We basically need to make sure to have, at least if this is no longer the case for securing the oceans, then who else will? So what are we talking about here? I don't believe that the US will just withdraw. As Alison pointed out, a withdrawal does not mean that, you know, we go home, because it's impossible for US to do that. But how much of presence, how much of will is left after the pandemic remains to be seen. So that's my best answer to that. Unfortunately, I have no better one.
Thank you. So no states in terms of winners and losers, just I understood. Can I ask maybe Alison or Katarina for short answers, or maybe
I can be very concise. I saw in the Q&A there was a question: did the pandemic increase animosity and competition? Short answer, yes, right? My husband makes fun of me for saying this, but countries behave like we are told on an airplane, like put your oxygen mask on first and then go help other people. So when you have a population that's getting sick and dying and you've got an economy that's tanking, you worry about yourself first, and then you go worry about your neighbors, because you can't do much help if you're incapacitated as well. Winners and losers, it's very difficult to specify specific countries at this point in time, because we're not sure how they're going to emerge. And even countries in East Asia that have handled the pandemic well still have their economies tied to trade and investment. And so if we see consumption in their export destinations going down, what does that mean for them? Can they find other consumers who's going to be able to buy? The only thing I would add to what Antonia said in terms of thinking of winners and losers is also the social and political dimension. So we're all thinking about how are these countries going to be managing their economies and how are they going to be able to recover. But you also have to remember then too, how are they going to manage their society's needs and tensions that are building up or have been building up for over a year now. So who's going to see unrest? Who's going to be able to manage unrest? How are they going to be able to manage the competing needs of people who have lost their jobs versus people who have not lost their jobs? And managing that, I think, is going to be just as important for being, emerging okay from this versus emerging in very poor conditions and having a recovery take much, much longer than just what you would do from the economic analysis. Because if you can't govern your country, if you can't control it, or you have a lot of problems internally, it's going to be very hard to recover your economy at the same time.
Thank you, Alison, for your answer and for answering one of the questions. I just sent out the invitation for people who have questions to address directly to Antonia, maybe, or you on Facebook. Katarina, would you like to react to this question or to what was said?
I do agree that there are no winners and losers. We are just using those terms because we don't have better one. I think that the winners are those countries that in a way saved their people. So in my opinion, the winners are those countries that have the least amount of dead people, if I may need to be bluntly, and to say directly. So those countries are winners, in my opinion. Not all countries handle this pandemic in a good way. And if you didn't handle the pandemic in a good way, then you didn't handle the economic recovery in a good way. So that's just simple as that. And as Alison said, of course, it's difficult at this moment because we still don't have final data for the 2020 for the main financial economic institutions. So they just have some preliminary data. it is difficult to say at this point of view who is the winner and who is the loser. But I just want one more time to emphasize that the East Asian countries in a way do lead. If you see their rise of their GDP and the income that they accumulated. Of course, I do understand they depend on the consumption coming from the developing countries, but I don't see in a recent time that will change. And of course, the countries that are mostly endangered are the developing countries and African countries. I think that we didn't help them enough. Who is responsible, you ask me? Everybody is responsible, but those that do have the money are the most responsible, you know? When you have enough money, you need to help those who are in need. So Africa is a soft spot for all of us and something that is bothering, I think, everybody in the world. And I think that we need to help African countries and African continent more. And unfortunately, the situation there is not so good. So in a way, I do hope that some things regarding global governance and global economy will change. I try to be optimistic, even when I see bad stuff.
So I understand that from all your answers during our session that actually the North is the winner again and the South is the loser somehow. But I very much like, Katarina, your message. The winners are those who don't, those countries that succeeded in preserving their human resource and to have as many people as possible survive. And I think this is a very generous message. I would like to thank everybody, Antonia, for giving us the opportunity to discuss on the basis of her book, which I would urge you to look for and get and read, and keep an eye on what Antonia is going to produce further, because she's a prolific writer. And I would very much like to thank Alison, because she got up early for us in the US. Thank you very much. And to Katarina for joining this team. Thank you very much. And I hope we will keep in touch and we'll do more discussions in the future. And thank Black Sea Trust as well a lot. All the best to you. Thank you, all our viewers, for being with us. Bye-bye.